Hello and welcome to Unacademy. As part of the Hindu analysis today, we'll be discussing 6 very important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, a very important announcement for you that the 29,999 price, which had been recently been introduced, the lowest price ever, is ending today. So if you've ever considered to be part of Unacademy and getting some guidance from us, this is the right time to do it. And we also have the Triumph batch, which is running since 8th of June. Now, looking at the topics which we have to cover today, we have 2 topics which will converge together. We'll also discuss the answer to the question which I gave you yesterday. So, in the last topic, which was about the Jagannath temple itself, I gave you a question. I did not give you the answer. A lot of you did answer the question, some of you correctly, some of you incorrectly, in the chat box itself. I'll give you the answer to that question. I'll explain to you what is the answer, and then we'll start with a very interesting article in the international edition wherein there is a discussion about division of cultural space and antiquities. Then these two are related to the G7 itself, which is the summit which is happening as of right now. Though there's nothing concrete which has come out, but there are multiple angles which we need to look at, and we'll do that. Thereafter, we'll talk about NATO actually funding a scientific research in the Arctic Circle itself based on sonars, and Russia being a very important angle in that. Then we'll talk about 2 from economics. And here I have actually given you in this 2 previous year questions and 1 previous year question here to show you how these topics are asked in the examination and why do we do it in the CNA itself. So, with this, let's start our discussion first, and let's look at the question which I gave you yesterday. This was the last question, the last thing which we did yesterday, and let's look at the question. Consider the following statements. The Nagara style of architecture can be divided on the basis of Shikhar or regional variations and regional variations. The Vimana of the Dravida style is similar to the Shikhara of the Nagara style. The Vallabhi style of Shikhar has a rectangular base. Now 90% of you have given the right answer, which is all these statements are correct, but some of you have gone with only 2. So either it was this statement or this statement which basically confused you. Now, first things first, I told you yesterday also that Nagara style can be divided according to Shikhar and according to regional variation, wherein you have Shikhar, Latina, Famsana or Vallabhi, and here you have Odisha, the Khajuraho and the Solanki one. This is based on certain variations in the base style itself. This is based on the curvy linearity of the Shikhar. So this is a correct statement. The second statement is where you need to have conceptual clarity, which is if I have a Nagara style temple, I have a Vimana, or rather a Shikhar, and then I have an Amlaka, and then a Kalash. This is called Shikhar, this is called Amlak, this is called Kalash. However, in Dravida, the terminology changes, wherein what you see as the Shikhar in the Nagara style actually is called Vimana, Viman, Shikhar, and the top of the Viman is actually called Shikhar. So Amlak Kalash is gone, Shikhara comes to the top, Shikhar itself means peak. So what is this saying? Vimana of Dravida style is similar to Shikhara of Nagara style. Totally similar, exact same thing. The differentiation is in nomenclature. And then comes Vallabhi style. Vallabhi style we know is known for its vaulted chambers, and vaulted chambers can only be there if it is the base itself is rectangular. So therefore all these statements are correct. This was given to you yesterday. I hope you were able to get the right answer. With this, let's start our discussion for today, as there was no from the archive section as it is a Saturday newspaper. So we will start with a very interesting article in the international edition, specifically given for Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. I hope that you have already gone through Sarmad sir's session on Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and the issue, or rather now the non-issue, with regards to the capital shifting. And now Hyderabad has ceased to be the capital of Andhra Pradesh and only the capital of Telangana in that regard. And there are multiple issues which we've discussed previously also in CNA, wherein we talked about what are called the scheduled 9 and 10 institutions, specifically the corporations or the public sector corporations, which have to get divided. So when there is a bifurcation like this into two states, mostly bifurcation leads to bifurcation of space, of institutions, but also of culture. Now, what I mean by schedule 9 and 10 is very simple, which is Andhra Pradesh had multiple enterprises which need to get divided between the Telangana state and the Andhra state, and there's a lot of contagious issues and lot of conflict which is there as of right now vis-a-vis who should get what. Though with the election results itself, the dynamism will change. However, the issue remains the same, which is this type of bifurcation will always lead to shadow conflicts which happen in public, some conflicts happen in the background. And the dividing a culture in this article itself talks about a certain division which is happening in the shadows of all of this. We are talking about the political space, we are talking about the economics of it, that how will these two states divide the debt also. We've discussed that previously also. The public debt has to get divided, the debt itself, the corporation, the dividends all have to get divided. So therefore that is something which everybody knows, but there is also a certain space beyond it and behind it, and therein lies the museum called Dr. Y.S. Rajshekhar Reddy Museum in Hyderabad. Now this museum, though a state museum, is considered very, very important in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, in Buddhist circles, it is considered extremely important. There are multiple events which happen throughout the year here because of a certain what we call as artifact which is housed in this museum itself. And when there was a division according to this political space between Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, Hyderabad, as it is we know, has gone to Telangana. There is now a question over antiquities. How will antiquities get divided? And there have been 3 committees or 3 antiquity committees which have met recently, and there has been a very interesting way in which there's a division. But that division itself creates multiple questions, and one of the archaeologists had actually given a very interesting quote to the Hindu, which we'll discuss. And these type of questions are becoming very, very common in GS paper 1, so it generally becomes important for your preparation. Now, the reason why this what we call as museum is considered so important is because of this room. This room is the Buddhist circle room, and in the middle we have a certain set of artifacts along with 16 sites which are described as the way Buddhism spread after the 6th century BCE into the Andhra, Telangana or this whole Deccan sector, thereafter going into South India. And as it is, this sector with Amravati and Nagarjunakonda being very, very important generally as Buddhist sites, and we have multiple stupas. Nagarjunakonda, we had to actually take out, salvage it out of the dam itself. That way, it is a very interesting and important sector for Buddhism. Therefore, this artifact is considered very, very important because this artifact in 1993 was excavated from Bavikonda. From Bavikonda, why is this considered important? Because these are Buddha's relics, considered to be extremely holy in Buddhist pilgrimage and philosophy. These are Buddha's relics. They are placed in these earthen pots as they were found in Bavikonda, and they are placed according to the way they were found also. Within it you have these beads and gold objects which are shining exactly the way they were 2000 years ago, and therefore it is considered that the blacksmith and the goldsmith came together to create a certain alloy of gold in that regard, that it is still shining till today since it was put in with Buddha's relics in that regard. So that way this is considered a very, very important artifact and an antiquity and its Buddha relics. This is what is the main center of attraction. You can't even enter into this museum with your shoes itself, because it is considered holy and revered by multiple different, from Nepal. You get it from Nepal, from Southeast Asia, from China, even multiple sectors, multiple pilgrimages come from different parts of Southeast Asia to see this, because this is mostly relics. What they're done are put inside stupas. So you have, for example, the stupa either in the anda or in the harmika, they place the relics. So that way it is very, very difficult to see the relics itself, because either it is in this solid anda itself, and therefore they would have to excavate inside it, and or they have to then go up the anda and find the relic inside the harmika, which is not considered something very good. And therefore, for the first time, they found relics not embedded within stupas. That is why it is quite important. The next antiquity, which is again in the news and has been talked about, is this cannon from the colonial era. And this was actually a cannon which was placed by the British in one of the police stations in Hyderabad, though being a princely state itself, with a resident. This was given by the British to the Nizam. Now the question about all of this is, who gets it? The question is, who will get it? When 6th century BC Buddhism existed or was spreading in this sector, there was no Andhra Pradesh and there was no Telangana. There was the cultural space of Andhra Telangana and this whole area itself. Same way, we have the princely state of Hyderabad, which included multiple states at this point of time. Who will get this antiquity? That is the question. Therefore, they needed to decide a certain principle. The principle which has been brought in by the committee itself is the following. Any antiquity which was found before 1956, which is before the States Reorganization Act, remains with Telangana, and any antiquity which is found between 1956 and 2014, which is from State Reorganization Act to the bifurcation itself, will be divided according to 52-48, according to percentage of population, ratio of population. So, for example, if there were 1,000 books, or let's take a lower number, if there were 100 books, 52 will go to Andhra Pradesh and 48 will go to Telangana. That is how they're dividing it. Now, ironically, because this excavation happened in 1993, this whole room is being now relocated to the to-be capital of Amravati, and this will not remain with Telangana, will not remain with this museum in Hyderabad. The same time, this will also go to Andhra Pradesh because it was discovered, or rather it was added to the museum only after 1960s. Therefore, this principle is what is called as division of cultural spaces. What they've done is that they found a cutoff date. They found a cutoff date. Anything before it remains with Telangana outrightly. After it, it gets bifurcated. Now, this date is not a cultural date. It is not a historical date, and actually is just related to the State Reorganization Act, through which we have the linguistic reorganization of India. The idea is, this doesn't mean that it will do justice to the way the artifacts were found or where they should be. And more than that, how can I divide cultural spaces in the larger context? Because if, for example, I have an artifact, for example, a manuscript, let's take into consideration. If the manuscript is a Telugu manuscript which has been found just near the Maharashtra border. Now, technically, it is what we call as manuscript of the Telangana Andhra Pradesh sector. But then who will get it? And it has been discovered after 2014. Then who will get it? That is the question. The idea is cultural spaces keep on evolving, and cultural spaces are not demarcated by political acts. Now, what is even more interesting is that there is also a shadow conflict going on in who has more Buddhist sites, wherein the 16 sites which are mentioned, 16 which are mentioned in this space, actually are all in Andhra Pradesh today after bifurcation. And therefore, what Telangana has been doing is, it's trying to break the silence and trying to add more spaces via the sites which it is actually trying to excavate, and a lot of money has been put in by the Telangana government to actually develop Phenigiri. If you've been part of our course in a UCAN session, I have discussed Phenigiri, wherein it has become a very important site which has yielded close to 5,000 what we call as artifacts related to Buddhism. And that ways, what Telangana is developing is a Buddhavanam, which is a theme park around these sites itself, wherein they are trying to develop a certain cultural space, but a narrative. This is the real battle. It is a battle of narratives, wherein Andhra Pradesh has a certain narrative which is already written on the museum walls, and Telangana is trying to create a new narrative via these sites itself. Now, the question with regards to this division of cultural space is very well captured by a quote which has been given in this article by the archaeologist and the archivist and the museologist of this Hyderabad museum. He says, and I quote, "How can they bifurcate culture and history? It is not a property, it cannot be divided. For example, Nanya Bharatam belongs to all. How can we say that the manuscript belongs to one state?" What is basically referring to is the Telugu Mahabharata, and written by Adi Kavi Nanya. It is considered very, very important. Now the question is, when this text was produced, it was not produced specifically for Telangana or for Andhra Pradesh. It is in that same cultural space. And therein it creates a question for GS paper 1, that at the time when we are trying to repatriate, which is get back the antiquities which were taken away by smugglers out of India, within India itself, there is now a certain contested space. And that contested space is that two states are trying to figure out how to divide. Close to 15,000 books have been given to Telangana state. 7,000 books are being sent to Andhra Pradesh state. But the question is, how and why should I use 1956 as a cutoff date? This is the date which has been chosen by the Antiquities Committee, and that is the question which this article actually points out, which is dividing a culture. There's also the question of this dagger. It's called a jade dagger. It is the handle itself has been made by jade, pure jade, with the horse, what we call as imprint on it. This is again, who will take it? Because there are certain artifacts which have to be seen in a certain context. There are multiple documents related to the what we call as Deccani Sultanates. They also have to be understood, and they can be only understood and interpreted by the state museum which they have. Now, for example, I take it out of a museum which is a state museum or what we call as a library in Telangana, but the specialist is in Telangana and it has been placed in Andhra Pradesh. Now, how do we manage that? So this article actually points out a very interesting battle other than the political and the economic, which is a historical one. A historical one in which now these spaces are getting contested, and whilst we have contestation there's a lot of contestation with regards to artifacts also, a shadow conflict which nobody wants to talk about. And therefore, it comes into our focus, and in the examination it can be asked like this. See, at a time when repatriation of cultural objects is gathering pace across the world, which is, there's a lot of questions. For example, there are multiple requests which have come to the British Museum itself to repatriate cultural objects. The British Museum is nothing but basically a Chor Bazaar itself, wherein they have taken everything from different spaces out of the world. Most of the artifacts in the British Museum is Indian. Tipu Sultan's sword to most of the princely states, and even the artifacts and the manuscripts which were related to the early successor states and the rebel states are in the British Museums itself. And that is only colonialism which gave them that. They don't have their own culture that way. But the question is, there's a major pace and an acceleration in this idea that we should give, or they should give back everything to where they got it from. Now the question is, if they start to do that, there will be nothing left in those museums. But in India itself, with Telangana and Andhra Pradesh bifurcation of antiquities, it's an interesting challenge which has now been created. So the statement is, at the time when repatriation of cultural objects is gathering pace across the world, the Telangana and the Andhra Pradesh bifurcation of antiquities pose an interesting challenge. In the light of our statement, discuss the challenges of such endeavors or endeavor. Now, here please remember the challenges you have to be very clear about. I'll give you the arguments out of this article itself. First challenge is how to divide. How to divide, because when culture develops, or the history of this sector did not develop in two cultural spaces but in one, the history of the Deccan in that regard. Thereafter, the second challenge is, if I use it as a cutoff date, then is it doing justice to the artifacts and the manuscripts itself? Should they be in that cultural space or not? Then comes the third challenge, which is of narrative. How do you produce that narrative, and are they distorting the narrative or not? Which is, it could be that two new narratives are being created, and for example, there could be contestation over who really has control or who should have control over those Buddha relics in that regard, considered very holy that way. And last but not the least is, in this form, history itself and culture itself is jeopardized, it is challenged, it is made vulnerable, because the more you start to divide history, so as to quote Rao, that the more you bifurcate culture and history, the more it becomes what we call as problematic, and the more narratives you get, the more distorted or interpolated it gets, which is, there's more and more interpretations which will come in, which is not good for this space in that regard. So this type of question is very, very potent for GS paper 1, and I hope that you will be able to answer these type of questions now with the article. There was one question, previous year question, in which they did ask that how can you protect our monuments. Since then, in GS paper 1, there has been a change. In 2023, they have changed the pattern by adding ancient and medieval in the mains. In mains, ancient medieval doesn't come. Prelims, you get ancient and medieval. Modern art and culture was something which was directly quoted in the main syllabus. But in 2023, they've gone for an anomaly. And with anomalies, these type of questions become very, very relevant in the larger context of your preparation. With this, let's move to the next two articles. Together, they will make us understand G7 better, or the G7 summit. Now, there are two things which are happening together. One is the G7 leaders meeting, and the other is the G7 summit. Why? Because in the G7 leaders summit, there will be our Prime Minister in the summit, but in the G7 itself, we will not have India. See, we were greeted to this image last night, and something very interesting, the most vibrant and what we call as largest democracy at this point of time, our Prime Minister was kept center stage. That ways, he has also quoted that the what we call as the election results is a victory for democratic world. That is true, because our transition of power between one Lok Sabha to the next Lok Sabha is always very peaceful that ways, and that ways Indian elections or the election results itself was a victory for the democratic world, of the democratic principles in that regard, and that ways he's right in saying that the whole process with its small hiccups shows the resilience of Indian democracy. Now, one interesting personality which you can see here is the Pope, and this is his first time coming to the summit. Now, just to give you an context in between the difference between G7, G20, G8 and G7 summit, you need to understand there are different configurations of countries. See, in G7 you have Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the USA. G8 has now become redundant because Russia and NATO conflict itself has pushed it out of the cultural space, or rather the political space or the geopolitical space of G7 and G8. G8 used to be important. Now G7 is the core what we call as NATO abiding and anti-Russian faction in the world itself. But we are part of the larger group, which is the G20, wherein India, EU, China, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea and Turkey, together we make the G20. So we have the G20 members, then the G7 members, and Russia, if you add it to it, becomes G8. Now, why did I say that when I say G7 leaders, I don't include India? Because G7 core members are will actually not include India. But in the summit, India has been invited. Our Prime Minister has been invited by the Italian government, and they're not just him, but the Vatican City itself and other actors across the world. But the question was, they can't ignore India. This is the 5th consecutive time that India has been part of the G7 summit itself, and that ways it is quite significant, because though we have groupings like this, the importance of India in the larger geopolitical space cannot be ignored, as the article points out and argues. Now, though there has been no communication with regards to what are the concrete steps which has been taken through this G7 summit in Italy, we have certain images which tell us a story and reminds us of issues which you should remember and you have to remember, and we'll talk about certain pledges which have been taken by G7 members separately and by the whole G7 summit. So remember, I'm trying to create a distinction between G7 and G7 summit. Now, there are 3 interesting images in this whole summit till this point. Our Prime Minister only had 24 hours here. He was not part of the deliberation thereafter. There are also multiple images of Biden actually not knowing what to do or being totally, completely lost in the process itself, his age showing. And in America itself, there's a certain Trump-driven rhetoric that he's not fit for the office itself, but he's not doing that with a lot of justice and good to his case itself, that he is mostly lost over. You would have seen memes and multiple images in that regard. Now, the first is the Pope and the interaction of our Prime Minister. This was a very warm interaction that way and shows a certain cultural interaction which he had previously also. The Pope being here is a very interesting aspect, he being the political and the religious head of the Vatican City itself. The idea was that he was there to argue for, in his first address to the summit, for peace. For peace, though Christianity in that regard and Vatican itself has been known to have a troubled history with peace and conflict, the idea was he was there to give the message of peace, and that is specifically in reference to Russia and Ukraine. And with Zelensky there was a Ukraine angle also, which we'll talk about. The other one was a very warm interaction between Rishi Sunak and our Prime Minister, wherein they have now argued for, and they've talked about 2 things, which is a UK-India roadmap 2030, in which they're trying to create a certain roadmap for political and economic cooperation. And the argument which was given by the UK representative was that the FTA, the free trade agreement, which is being negotiated with the UK, is going in the right direction and is very satisfactory. Again, as I told you, because it has only been 8-9 hours to this whole concept itself, tomorrow's newspaper is going to most probably have more concrete pledges and arguments in that regard. But what is most talked about is this. Whilst the Prime Minister met with multiple leaders in the sidelines, there was no meeting between Canada and India. Trudeau and our Prime Minister did not have any scheduled meeting, though they met briefly in this context. And with regards to the Khalistani issue and Canada and his own constituency being the Khalistanis in Canada itself, there was a lot of tension in the air that will they meet, will they not meet. But that ways our Prime Minister was warm and met him. But the subtext was that we will negotiate with everyone else in the sidelines of the G7 summit itself, but we don't want to negotiate or have any dialogue with you. This reminds us of a certain geopolitical space we are in today, wherein the US and Canada have become the space where the Khalistanis are breeding and are talking about the Punjab secessionist movement in that regard. And therefore, the subtext here is quite impressive and quite interesting. I will meet you. However, there is no scheduled meeting as the article points out. It is being argued by the article that this was noted by everybody, that there was no Canada-India interaction on the sidelines, and this was seen as a certain message by India to Canada that as much as we can be all good and jolly in front of the world and the summit, but in the sidelines we will not negotiate if you are not going to talk about, and the multiple accusations made on India with regards to the killing of multiple terrorists, Khalistani terrorists in Canada itself. Now, other than this, Zelensky's presence there was because of a certain pledge which the G7 members have made. The pledge is that we will support Ukraine as long as it takes. This is a G7 one, in this we are not involved, and $50 billion loan has now been offered by G7 to Ukraine to fight this war. Now, this is an argument where the NATO and the G7 is trying to send a message to Russia that we are firmly behind Ukraine, with multiple countries now contributing into the military space through their equipment also, which has been seen as an escalation by Russia. The question was, where is this $50 billion going to come from? And the argument was very simple. The Russian central bank seized assets. They will be either liquidated or sold to fund this $50 billion loan to Ukraine. This was the first pledge which was taken by the G7, not the summit, and this is basically adding to the tensions, and this tells us that this war is going to go on further. Ukraine is, the NATO is firmly behind Ukraine in that regard. The second and the third one are much easier and straightforward, which is that there was a pledge that we are going to phase out coal by 2030s, mid-2030s. Coal as a fossil fuel is going to be phased out by the G7 members in their own countries itself. Third was deeper cooperation in Africa, wherein the African nations need to get involved more in the geopolitical space of the NATO and the world itself, and the engagement there needs to be better. Again, this is a message to China, wherein China has been doing what we call as neo-imperialistic, following neo-imperialistic policies in Africa, wherein they're what is called debt capitalism or debt imperialism in that regard, that they're giving so much money to the African nations that they can't give it back, therefore creating their own political space there. And therefore they were saying that deeper cooperation will help us understand their plight better. Last but not the least was a pledge with regards to nuclear power, that we need to fund nuclear power research and fusion technology. As you know that in the nuclear reactors today, we have what is called as nuclear fission. Fission is when the atom is split, and that releases a lot of energy that is used to boil the water and therefore use it on turbines. On the other hand, fusion is when you don't split the atom, you actually bring two atoms together to create a heavier atom or a molecule in that regard, but that needs a lot of energy to, it releases a lot of energy, but a lot of energy is needed to do it also, and that is quite dangerous. That way we have no proper research. For the past 15 years we've been talking about a fusion reactor, experimental fusion reactor in the what we call a German sector, but again that has not given us any breakthrough. But fusion that way is the next horizon in nuclear power, which will make it more or less self-sufficient, because as of right now nuclear power and fission produces a lot of what we call as byproducts and radioactive material, which is not good for the environment. In fusion, the quantum of byproducts is going to be lower, and the yield of that whole process is going to be much higher. So they are saying we have to fund research in this area, and the G7 is going to do that. So with regards to this whole article, these two articles, there is nothing concrete given here. There is nothing concrete given here other than the argument that G7 is going to stand with the Ukrainian sector and the idea with regards to our democracy. There are no concrete, what we call as material which you can write in the examination. So for this topic, let's take up a prelims question, and again, as always, the answer needs to go into the comments section. Which of the following countries, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam and Indonesia, which of the above is are part of the G20 grouping? You have to either one, only two, only three, or all of them. I want the answer to this in the comment section, and we will see what is the percentage of students getting it right. Yesterday we did one question on history, today a question on international relations, a realistic question that way for the examination. With this, let's move to the next article, which is related to NATO and Arctic acoustic waves and Russian submarines. Now, let's first create the background. See, sonar technology is the most, if not the only, technology which is mostly used for underwater research, military warfare, and even any form of mapping other than new forms of what we call as wave technology coming in. But sonar is a very, very old technology which has been used to either map the what we call as floor bed of the ocean itself, or even find submarines or locate anything underwater. Now sonar that way uses what we call as a wave, which is the sonar wave itself, but the question or the topic which is being discussed here is acoustic waves. Acoustic waves, which are very important in the sonar technology itself, are nothing but sound waves which are used to either detect objects or understand the topography of the ocean floor itself. Now, the wavelength of these acoustic waves are quite sensitive to salinity of water, temperature and pressure, meaning that if you have to calibrate a sonar to be very, very effective and very, very what we call as sensitive to issues, what we call as small even bumps in the ocean bed, or to detect submarines, you have to calibrate it properly with regards to the pressure, temperature and salinity of water. For example, if an Indian ship is moving from the Pacific to the Atlantic, or from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, they have to recalibrate their sonar because of the changing temperature, pressure and salinity of water in all these three oceans. So there would be not a major difference, but the recalibration is very, very important. Now, there is a research which is happening as of today. An Italian ship which is in the Arctic Ocean, and in the Arctic Ocean or circle, they are trying to understand what has been the impact of climate change and global warming on the water salinity, temperature and pressure, with accelerated what we call as melting of the icebergs. And they are saying because the Arctic Circle has started to open up and the icebergs have started to melt, there's a lot of activity which is also going on in the Arctic Circle now, and therefore we need to also understand the acoustics of the Arctic Circle, which was previously something very interesting, and we had to recalibrate for this sector the sonar technologies. Now the argument which has been given by this team was or is that the Arctic Circle has always been silent, meaning because of its extreme cold temperatures and the iceberg or what we call ice breaking ships were very limited in this sector. If you went with a sonar technology to the Arctic Circle, it used to be more or less silent. There was a silence. The silence of the Arctic Circle and sea and the ocean has been talked about. Now what they are saying is that this silence has been broken, because there are multiple what we call as ships in this route because of the receding of the ice itself, and Russia, because it has a very important base in the Arctic Circle itself, has now started to become very active in this area. And what they are saying is that we need to recalibrate the sonars with changing salinity because of global warming and what we call as climate change. With changing salinity, with changing temperature and pressure, we need to recalibrate sonar. Now you will ask me one question, then where does the NATO angle come through? Where does the NATO angle come through? Ironically, NATO is funding this research because in order to detect Russian submarines, most of which are capable of having nuclear warheads, in order to detect Russian submarines, sonars have to be recalibrated. So in a way, it is like an excuse or a wheel which is being used. Behind this scientific research is the NATO interest to recalibrate sonars so that they can pick up Russian submarines better. This is in a way that old style proxy warfare where you have cultural or scientific interactions and the NATO is trying to use that scientific interaction or what was cultural interaction to do spying or espionage. That is why we call this era the Cold War 2.0, NATO versus Russia, wherein the Russian submarine presence in this sector is something which is problematic. And therefore, NATO is actually funding this Arctic acoustic waves research so that they can be better in locating Russian submarines. And all of this is not just an innocent noise pollution exercise or noise pollution based idea. It is rather having geopolitical angle and multiple implications for the later stages of this conflict, and we will see further development in this sector as the impacts of climate change comes through. But how NATO will manage this presence of the Russians, there are more ships, and with receding ice itself, a new route is emerging between the Pacific and the Atlantic in that regard. That way it is quite significant. So you can see how something quite innocent can also have geopolitical implications. So let's look at a question for this. The silence of the Arctic has been broken. In light of the above statement, discuss the emerging challenges in this fragile ecosystem due to global warming. Now, this is an exact quote out of the newspaper. So for a student who has not gone through the Hindu newspaper, there is no context for this type of statement. If you have no idea about this article, you will never be able to write an answer like this, because this silence angle comes from acoustics, comes from sonars, and thereafter there is a certain research and the article is there. So if you are not going to read these type of articles and we're not going to discuss them, we will never be able to do the tricky questions. It's a tricky question because for a student who has no idea about any article or has never read this article itself, it is a random question. The silence of the Arctic has been broken. Now this silence, is it political silence? Is it geopolitical silence? Is it economic, or is it geographical? And therefore, this is the reason why we pick up these articles which have subtext to them, important for your preparation in that regard. Then we move to two articles which are related to economics, GS paper 3, one an NSSO survey and the other one related to trade. Now the question would be, sir, why are we doing this? Do I need to learn each and every data which has been given here? The answer to that question is no. Trends are always important for UPSC with regards to economics, as Shyam sir points out, and therefore trends is something which we are going to talk about. But this article has a little bit of, again, context which is needed, and I'll talk about that first. Now, see, the informal economy is something which I have discussed yesterday also. I hope that you watched that video wherein I've discussed a 1974 article from the archives and a gig economy article where I've tried to bring in how there are two different principles which have been talked about, and today there is only the concept of floor wages and right to sustenance, whilst previously it was also about the efficiency of the worker. The informal sector is always in the news, and there's a previous year question on this. I will show it to you with regards to globalization. Now, what does this article points out? It first uses a division. When we talk about companies or enterprises, it says that there are two types, or rather it uses the word unincorporated and the incorporated enterprises. Now, incorporated, unincorporated basically means it's saying incorporated with respect to the concept of either incorporated under the Companies Act or some other statutory provision of the government. Unincorporated are which don't fall under the Companies Act, and the quantum of unincorporated sector, which basically automatically becomes the informal sector because it is not under any form of litigation or any form of law or regulation. The informal sector, within that the unincorporated firms and the employees to that. Please understand this point. Unincorporated firms within the informal sector and the employees, the quantum is staggering. The topic talks about, or the article talks about the fact that in the second wave of COVID-19, the impact on the informal sector was really hard. Specifically the informal economy, within that the unincorporated enterprises. This is not something which should be a surprise to you, because when it comes to vulnerability, this is the most vulnerable sector. For example, most of us or some of us, when we were within this COVID-19 crisis itself, we either got work from home or had certain safeguards within our work. Not true for everybody, but for some of us. Now, when we talk about these safeguards are not available to the informal sector automatically. There's no social security. It's a short-term contractual concept. So if in COVID-19 there is no demand, the unincorporated firms and sectors automatically disappear, and with that a very big quantum of labor becomes unemployed. And when there is an issue like that, how do you give employment to them is very important. Now, this data is to give you a certain sense of how big this sector is. You don't have to learn it. I'm just giving you a sense of this. The argument was that in 2020, previously, before COVID-19 hit the world itself, the quantum was close to the number which it is today in 2024 or 2023. But in 2021, after the second wave, the number which was brought in was, there are 50 lakh enterprises which are unincorporated enterprises. This could just be a hawker, could be a rickshawala, could be a person, not a rickshawala, but what we call as a person who sells things on a rickshaw or a cart itself. Those themselves are seen as an enterprise, but mostly it is basically the local markets which are there, unincorporated firms which are not under the Companies Act. These are proper firms which are under proper board of directors. These are unincorporated informal sector. So for example, a Sarojini Nagar market in which you have the proper shops, that would be either a part of incorporated. Some of them, small ones, may not be part of incorporated. Some of them may be part of the unincorporated. But everybody who is a hawker is an unincorporated enterprise. He could have certain employees, 7 to 8, but he is not under a Companies Act. He's not paying anything. He's not under certain forms of law or certain regulation in that regard. So the 50 lakh enterprises which are being quoted were employing close to 85 lakh informal labor with no form of social security, with no form of safeguards. The number by 2022 became 1.9 crore enterprises unincorporated and 3.1 crore informal labor. And just before the NSSO survey, the number had increased to 5.9 crore enterprises employing 9.8 crore informal labor, and the idea is by the end of 2024 the number is going to be staggering, which is 6.5 crore such enterprises and employing 12 crore people in these unincorporated enterprises. Obviously this data is irrelevant to you, but look at the quantum. Look at the quantum of the labor which is there. 85 lakh, 3.1 crore, 9.8 crore, 12 crore informal labor in this sector. Now you tell me, with such a big sector, there is no regulation and there is no scheme as of right now. PM Swanidhi would work, but with the quantum, there is no proper registration, there is no exact list, and these 12 crore people, we believe that at this point of time in 2019, just before COVID-19, the number would have been close to 5 crore, 6 crore. So let's assume that it was only 9 crore people. The idea was, firstly, imagine in the second wave, 9 crore people, mostly migrants, were out of work and were hit the most and with the worst impact. And though there has been a certain increase from 6 to 8% year on year, the idea is they need protection. They need a certain safeguarding of the informal sector. We can't have a sector which is contributing enormously to the GDP unregulated. And the question with regards to why am I discussing this with you, I want to show you a previous year question. You see, the 2016 question which is on the top says, how globalization has led to reduction of employment in the formal sector of the Indian economy. Is increased informalization detrimental to the development of the country? This is a very interesting question. It is basically asking you the impact of globalization on employment and formal sector, which is again true, because with jobs moving out of India, you will get informalization of labor. But if you don't understand what is informal, you will never be able to answer this question. If you say that informalization is detrimental to the development of the country, then you are saying that 12 crore people are in the wrong space itself. Informalization is not detrimental for the development of the country. It is a certain feature of Indian development, and informalization is happening across the world itself. So in order to answer this question, if you can sprinkle a little bit of this trend, which is that with 12 crore people, or for example with 7 crore enterprises in India which are in the informal sector, they are a very important part of the Indian economy. The demand which they are quenching or they are satisfying with regards to the commodities is huge. So when it comes to consumption, they have to be taken into consideration. So you can get a question like this, vis-a-vis trying to incorporate what I did yesterday and today, is that with close to 12 crore men and women engaged in unincorporated enterprises, discuss the need for proper regulation and safeguards in this sector. Then you can use the principles which I referred to yesterday, wherein the idea that the efficiency, the health, the fact that the what we call as the wage in this sector cannot be just based on floor wages. You need to protect and engage with these men and women who are involved in a very important sector. The last survey of the NSSO argues 96% of all labor in India is informal, which is again a very staggering number. In developed countries, it would be a little bit lower, but there is also informalization happening there also. It's not that the US does not have informalization. Informalization is a trend itself. So there's a certain way, there's a certain saying in labor history that there is in the world as of right now, there's a process which had been pushed through, which is formalization through informalization. Meaning that when there will be no formal labor itself, then what will you call informal? because I can create a distinction right now that this person is a formal labor, he has safeguards, he has social security, he has everything. Therefore, he is a formal sector employee. So there will be a person who can be called informal. But across the world, what is happening is these people are being pushed into this group via either short-term contracts or the work from home concept itself change the contracts of a lot of people, and therefore there is informalization of them, but the whole economy will be called formal only if every labor is informal. That is why formalization through informalization. Very interesting concept which even the government of India and the Niti Aayog as of right now is discussing. It's out of a report of the Niti Aayog and an article which was published in the EPW, which is formalization through informalization, which is an idea which totally changes your perspective about how things are happening. But please understand, it's a critical area. It's not a random topic I'm discussing. It is a critical area. I've given you a practice question. I'm showing you a previous year question so that you understand the importance of it. The last topic is again related to GS paper 3 and economics, which is exports and imports, balance of trade and balance of payment. These are two important topics, static topics of economics. And see, exports grew at 9.1%, $38 billion. Imports grew at 7.7%, $61 billion. That ways, this is a good trend, though the value-wise, balance of payment-wise, there's a deficit. But the fact that the exports are growing faster than imports is a good thing. This is the first thing which can be understood as a trend. I'll show you there were two previous year questions just based on trends. And thereafter, the idea is as much as there is a mismatch, a positive mismatch, wherein the exports are growing and the imports are growing at a lower pace, the deficit, however, is at a 7-month high. At $23 billion in May, there's a merchandise trade deficit. This is specific to merchandises. The merchandise trade deficit is at the 7-month high in that regard. Now, again, what do I do with this information? The Trade Secretary has made a very interesting point. That is the implication, that is the mains part. This is what he said with regards to what do we understand out of this trend. He argues that because India is growing at more or less 6 to 7% and the world is growing at 1.7 to 2.6%, there's a mismatch between the economic growth of India and the world. And if that is going to happen, there are two implications which explain this trend. First, there are twin effects. Higher domestic demand will mean less exportable surplus, meaning because Indian economy is faster than the world economy, which means that the growth is faster, means that there is more demand in India. So if there's more demand in India, as much as we would like to export to the world to reduce this deficit, our internal demand itself is not allowing us to have a very substantial exportable surplus. First. Second thing which it is saying is that our requirements for imports will also be higher if we are growing faster. So this is like a dual effect. Because our demand and consumption is high, for that demand and consumption, we need to import more. And because the demand is so high, it is consumed within the economy, we can't export more. So the reason why this is encouraging is that because we are importing at a lower percentage growth and exporting at a higher percentage growth, this is considered important. Though it matters what are you importing and exporting. If you're importing raw material and exporting finished goods, that's a very good thing. Therein, high imports is not a bad thing. However, if you're importing finished material and exporting only the what we call as exportable surplus or something for namesake, then it makes no sense. So though the article says that we need to see the profile itself, this is what I wanted you to understand, because this can come in the examination. That how do you explain the trends in India? And if you'll understand this trend, you'll be able to answer these two type of questions better. One question which came in 2017, one question which came in 2020. I'll again read the questions out to you. I want the answers to these questions. This is question number 3. This is question number 2. That was question number 1. I want it in the chat box. You would have either done it or practiced it, but I want you to understand why do we do what we do. Why am I doing a certain article with you is something more important than the article itself, because you will then start to look at all the static material from a different perspective itself. So, which of the following have occurred in India after its liberalization of economic policies in 1991? Share of agriculture in GDP increased enormously. Share of India's exports in world trade increased. FDI inflows increased. India's foreign exchange reserves increased enormously. You have to choose. This was the old golden days, the era of elimination. Ironically, if you can spot one very obvious, very obvious statement in this, which actually is also an extreme statement, you will be able to come to the answer, and I want you to do that. Second, now this, why did I say, see, world trade export. We're discussing world trade export trends. Export trends become important. Same way you see this question. With reference to the international trade of India, this is out of BOP, and in BOP all this data becomes important. With reference to international trade of India at present, which of the following statements are correct? India's merchandise export are less than its merchandise export is less than its merchandise imports. Exactly what is given in this article. This article is exactly about merchandise trade deficit. Trade deficit. So this question can only be answered if you are following the trends. So exports are less than imports. India's import of iron and steel, chemicals and fertilizers and machinery have decreased in recent years. India's export of services are more than its imports of services. India suffers from an overall trade or / current account deficit. Which of the following statements are correct? Again, there's one obvious one. If you understand the Indian economy and you've been following us, you will be able to easily understand which is the statement which is wrong. So I want the answer for question number 1, question number 2 and question number 3 in the chat box, in the comment section, and you will write A, B, C, D, whatever is the answer, and we'll discuss it the next time we'll meet. We'll discuss all these 3 questions the next time we'll meet. All the best to all candidates who are going to give the examination tomorrow. You got this. Don't worry. With a cool mind, go into the examination. We'll be there with the Hindu analysis tomorrow also, and we also have the paper discussions at different times of the day itself. I hope that you will join us for that also. Do remember that this is not the time to panic and open new sources. It is a time to revise, consolidate. It has already been 364 days. You can't do anything in one day. So rather consolidate, and remember, do CSAT questions coolly, and at the same point of time, look at the questions and assess the level. If the level of the question paper is hard, it is hard for everybody. It is easy for everyone. That will change your approach. With 75 marks as the cutoff, anything and everything can happen. So do not panic in the exam hall. Manage your time well, and all the best. Thank you. I will see you tomorrow with another set of issues. Take care. Bye-bye.